His Excellency Mr. Charles Hay, High Commissioner of the United Kingdom to Malaysia, Ms. Lavanya Rama Iyer of the World Wildlife Fund Malaysia, and the moderator for this session, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. We are indeed very honored to have with us here the British High Commissioner, His Excellency Charles Hay, to have this conversation with our participants to provide an update on COP26. The UK government organized very successfully COP26 in Scotland last year and have achieved several important milestones. And it would be very useful for us to hear from the High Commissioner on what COP26 has achieved and what more we can expect going forward. I believe that COP26 is a major initiative that has brought all countries of the world together to plan and to chart the way forward for us to deal with climate action. And it is interesting to learn from the High Commissioner a while ago that COP will now be an annual conference, and the next conference will be held in Egypt, hopefully, and that we can make further progress. So without any further ado, I will hand over to the moderator, Lavanya, to introduce the session and to then invite the High Commissioner to address us and to take questions thereafter. Lavanya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tan Sri Michael, and a very good afternoon to everybody. Good afternoon, Your Excellency. So yes, we have come now to the final segment of today's very exciting summit on ESG, and of course it's my very great pleasure to invite His Excellency Charles Hay, the British High Commissioner to Malaysia, to give us some insights on COP26 that was very successfully held in Glasgow in November last year, after having been postponed from 2020 due to the COVID situation. And indeed, that was no mean feat, I think, hosting an event of the scale of COP26 with tens of thousands of participants in the midst of COVID. And I'm happy to say I had first-hand experience as I attended the COP myself. So, as we all know, and as Tan Sri has mentioned, Glasgow COP was very much anticipated, and there were many initiatives that were undertaken, particularly by the host country, the UK, in the lead up to the COP. We had the dire warning from the IPCC report that time was indeed running out and that concerted effort was strongly needed to have a fighting chance of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees within the time frame of what has been assessed to be the remaining 11 years. Here in Malaysia, I know the High Commission has been very active in engaging with various stakeholders to increase awareness and build consensus on a strong outcome at COP26. WWF-Malaysia had the privilege of collaborating with the High Commission on a number of events where our focus was to highlight the importance of nature and climate action, an issue that I believe COP26 certainly sought to champion with nature and nature-based solutions as key themes. The High Commission also very kindly helped in our stakeholder engagements with various missions on the study which WWF Malaysia and BCG jointly conducted called Securing Our Future Net Zero Emission Pathways for Malaysia, which was successfully launched in COP26 in Glasgow. And of course, it's available for online reference. We are now working together also on building materials to understand nature-based solutions together with the High Commission. So thank you, Your Excellency, and your team for these excellent opportunities to collaborate. And before I pass the floor to His Excellency, allow me to provide a brief introduction. His Excellency Charles Hay, MBO, started as the British High Commissioner to Malaysia in March 2019. Prior to Malaysia, Mr. Hay was the British ambassador to South Korea from 2015 to 2018. During his time in the British Diplomatic Service, He has been posted to the Czech Republic, Spain, and the UK representation to the EU in Brussels. His Excellency was also the Director of Consular Services in London, responsible for assisting British nationals and in crisis management worldwide. Before joining the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1993, he was a captain in the British Army. His Excellency is married and they have 2 children, 2 daughters. He has a master in business administration as well as a BA in philosophy and politics. His hobbies include golf, diving, and archery. So, without further ado, over to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much indeed, Lavanya, for that introduction. I'm never very sure whether to be glad to appear at the end of the day in a conference, but I'm choosing to look on this as being the high point which everybody else has been building up to. But thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much, Tansri, for your words. It's great to be here with the KSI Strategic Institute and the Economic Club of KL. And I've been asked to just give a few reflections on COP26, which I will do. But let me start with a personal reflection. You were referring back to my career. One thing that you didn't mention was that in 2005, I was heavily engaged in the G8 summit. And back then, Tony Blair, who was the Prime Minister of the UK, he chose 2 themes for the 2005 G8 summit. One was Africa and development, and the other was climate change. Now, that was seen at the time as being a rather odd choice. A lot of people questioned it. And it's interesting to see how in the space of the years since then, climate change has become increasingly at the center of our diplomatic activity. And in fact, COP26 last year was absolutely the epicenter of everything that the British government, British diplomatic service was trying to do during the 2 years in the lead up, because of course, the first iteration of COP26 had to be delayed because of COVID. So the world has changed enormously. And I think what we've reached now is definitely a tipping point in the sense of global acceptance of the need for urgent change and the fact that we all need to work together collectively to tackle climate change. Because we know now, the science is very clear, that we have to work together to tackle this, and if we don't, then we're all going to fall together in a catastrophic way. We did see, I think, in Glasgow, in COP26, we did see the world coming together. Nearly 200 countries came together and agreed by consensus the Glasgow Climate Pact. And I suppose the main aim of what we were all trying to achieve was keeping 1.5 alive, keeping alive the possibility that we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And I think we achieved that. We achieved it with the important proviso that it will only work if all of the undertakings that we're given are fulfilled, which is always the issue. Our COP26 president, Alok Sharma, he said after Glasgow that 1.5 is alive, but the pulse is rather weak, which I think was a good way of putting it. So what I'm going to try to do is to highlight Malaysia's contributions to Glasgow's outcomes and opportunities to do more, and also to talk a bit about business and the implications for business, which is what much of the day has been focused on. So how did Malaysia contribute to the outcomes? Let me take you back 2 years to when the UK took over the presidency of COP26. At that time, only 30% of the world's economy was covered by carbon net zero commitments. Now it's 90%, and that of course includes Malaysia now, with the carbon neutral goal set out in the 12th Malaysia Plan. And I'll come back to that 90% a bit later on. Let me also set out for you a kind of framework of the main things that we were trying to achieve at Glasgow. Coal, cars, cash, and trees. So these are all, it's not all about those 4 things, but I think those 4 things cover the main areas that we wanted to make progress, and where we did make progress. On the nature-based solution, which you referred to, Malaysia signed up to the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use, and that is aimed at halting and reversing forest loss by 2030. Now, that was particularly important given Malaysia's carbon-dense forests. So that made Malaysia's participation in that declaration of global importance. Malaysia also signed the ambitious Global Methane Pledge, committing to contribute towards a 30% reduction in global methane emissions by 2030. And as you all know, methane is particularly powerful as a greenhouse gas. Malaysia was also very active in the FACT dialogue, the Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade dialogue. And that dialogue brought together for the first time producer and consumer countries to work together to make sure that our supply chains don't cause deforestation. Now, beyond these commitments at COP26, we also know that a national adaptation plan is in the works and also a long-term strategy on how Malaysia intends to realize that net zero ambition. And from the UK perspective, as presidency of COP26, this was all very, very welcome signs of ambition. COP26 has been and gone, but the UK continues as president of COP through the rest of this year until we hand over to our Egyptian colleagues for COP27 that will happen in Sharm el-Sheikh in November this year. And I'm very glad that we've already started talking intensively to the Egyptian government about how we do that together. And locally, I'm in close contact with my Egyptian counterpart on activities that we can take forward together in Malaysia. And I should also mention my Italian colleagues who also work with us in conjunction with as COP joint presidency. And we continue to work closely with the Italians locally as well. So as I say, 1.5 is alive, but the pulse is weak. But we're not yet on a pathway towards 1.5. There's a lot more to do in other sectors. Now this brings me back to the coal, cars, cash and trees framework. So cars refers not just to cars, but to the transport sector in general, which is a heavy contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So here in Malaysia, we're going to continue to urge accelerating adoption of electric vehicles, also charting a course for green shipping and aviation. And on coal, Malaysia has a particular issue that I'm sure many of you are aware of, in the sense that Malaysia is locked into some quite long-term coal contracts for power generation. We also need to invest more in nature. That could be restoring wetlands and mangroves, conserving watersheds and coral reefs, and protecting the ecosystems. And these so-called nature-based solutions can address multiple economic and environmental challenges and have a huge amount of potential, positive potential, not just the sense of avoiding any further damage. Later this year, the UN will adopt a new framework for biodiversity protection. That's really important for Malaysia as one of the most mega-diverse countries on the planet. And we need to be ambitious in this area as well. And over 100 countries now have signed up to a pledge calling for 30 by 30. That is, protecting 30% of the earth, both land and sea, by 2030. And it would be great to see Malaysia signing up to that 30 by 30 ambition. So let me come on now to the business aspects of this. So I mentioned 90%, which is now the proportion of the global economy committed to net zero targets of some kind or another. As I say, that's huge progress over the last years, and that is a tipping point. And I think business, in a way, has been amongst the first to grasp the significance of this, because business knows now that it must shift towards a carbon neutral model or be out of business. Investors are increasingly demanding climate friendly policies, and you've just heard about that from CIMB and others. Consumers and voters now know that their leaders have given commitments. Lavanya, you mentioned that I've got 2 teenage daughters. I can tell you that they are absolutely clear that we of our generation have to take action to not destroy the planet that they're going to inherit. And they're some of the most powerful voices that we hear now. And I think that tipping point is very visible here in Malaysia too. And some of the biggest and most influential companies here, such as Petronas, TMB, Bursa Malaysia and CIMB, have already set net zero ambitions. And I think that business is now very, very aware of the risk of so-called greenwashing. Nobody wants to be accused of greenwashing. So I think serious businesses are now serious about their targets as well. And many companies and entities have set climate commitments that are firmly science-based and based in very clear and deep analysis of how they're going to get there. So I have in mind here companies like Sarawak Energy, Sunway Medical Centre, Velocity, and FGV Holdings, who've done exactly that, set science-based targets, and they joined the UN's Race to Zero campaign. And I'd love to see more companies doing exactly the same thing. British business in Malaysia is also very active. We partnered with the British Malaysia Chamber of Commerce, organising Malaysia Climate Action Week last year. And 27 organisations have now signed up to the BMCC Climate Action Pledge. And again, I encourage other businesses to do that too. I think the days are past when business saw climate action as a cost. I think increasingly more and more businesses are seeing it as an opportunity. So you've been talking earlier about the expanding green finance and investment sector. And the High Commission, we're very proud to have partnered with Bank Negara, Bursa Malaysia and others in setting up the Malaysian Sustainable Finance Initiative with the aim of building capacity for the future and the coming changes in the financial sector. And one example, and you may have been discussing this already, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, and the rising profile of climate disclosures and the way that investors are increasingly demanding climate disclosures before they're willing to invest, or indeed threatening to disinvest from companies that are not going down that road. We also saw at Glasgow the launch of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and that brings together some 450 institutions, together responsible for around $130 billion of assets. All of them have committed to net zero transitions. And again, CIMB is one of their number. And we're seeing a growing emphasis here on ESG compliant investments by some of Malaysia's biggest financial institutions, EPF, PNB, Khazanah. And I think all of that demonstrates the momentum that we're seeing building in this sector. We've also seen some very interesting developments in cities. Cleaner, greener cities, of course, are highly desirable for the inhabitants of the cities, and demands for that are growing. And KL has now set a net zero target, and we were proud to support the development of the KL Climate Action Plan 2050. And that's a really exciting area for technological innovation to take us forward to meet these targets. And last year, we in the High Commission published a comprehensive Smart Cities Handbook in collaboration with the Housing Ministry, and you can download that online. And we're following that up next week with a 3-day UK Smart Cities mission to Malaysia. And I'm delighted that the Housing, Communication and Transport Ministers will address that event. And I think that shows the political commitment and interest. And we're seeing a large number of UK stakeholders and technology providers taking part in that. And again, if anybody out there is interested in taking part, please do get in touch. We're seeing shifts in our own UK trade policy. Our national export credit agency, UK Export Finance, is now committed to decarbonising its portfolio and now has its own net zero commitment. And like the UK Trade Department, they will no longer support UK interests in projects in coal and oil production, and they'll only consider gas if strict considerations are met. Over the last couple of years, we've become acutely aware of global supply chains, and carbon criteria are also becoming increasingly important in supply chains. And I believe that Malaysia's export competitiveness will depend on responding to growing expectations in export markets. Businesses are acting to cut the carbon embodied in their goods and services. And increasingly we're seeing that when potential investors are looking for what countries they're going to invest in, one of the questions they're asking is, what is the carbon intensity of our footprint if we were to invest in this country? And I think increasingly countries will become less attractive investment destinations if they have a high carbon intensity economy. And I do believe that businesses are finding new opportunities in all of this ecosystem. And I'm sure all of you see this firsthand. Let me give you just one example. Last week, a British company called EV Charge was here in KL looking at manufacturing and investment opportunities in electric vehicle systems. And of course, electric vehicle adoption is not just about the vehicles, it's about the charging infrastructure, it's about the whole ecosystem that is needed to support it. And from transport to tourism and everything in between, no sector is going to be left untouched by the climate transition. So let me just stop there, and I hope that we'll have people who want to come in and challenge and ask questions on all of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I think you've given us very excellent overview of many issues, certainly on what Malaysia's participation in COP26 was, as well as the implications to business and what you are already seeing happening. I will open the floor for questions, both here physically as well as online. I understand there are a lot of people online as well. If you have questions, do please post it on chat and I will try and pick it up. But before that, maybe taking my moderator privilege, I would like to pose maybe one or two questions first to Your Excellency. I'm just wondering, you mentioned your teenage daughters, and of course, one big voice in all this climate is Greta Thunberg. And she was, quoted as saying, well, COP26 was another blah, blah, blah session, right? I'm just wondering, is there, what is your view on that? Is it, did we see more concrete action than what that statement might indicate? And if so, how do we build on that? How do we push that? I mean, yeah.
Well, the important thing is doing what we said we were going to do. And in that, I think one of the most important outcomes of COP26 is a process outcome, and that's the process of annual COP meetings where countries need to revise their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions. Because I think in the past, there has been a tendency among some countries they do their NDC, you get through the COP, and then you put it on the shelf, and then 3 years later, you bring it down, dust it off, and update it for the next COP. Well, that's not going to be possible anymore, because what we see now is annual COP meetings, annual adjustments and upgrades to NDCs. Now, of course, some people will say that's just talk. Talk is easy, talk is cheap. But I think it's very hard for governments, having made such very specific commitments, to renege on them. And I think also this is where the voice of business is incredibly important, because business has picked up on the direction of travel. And what business needs and wants, this as well or better than I do, is a very clear framework within which to operate. And countries that say one thing but then act in a different way and then go back to the next COP and say something else and act in a different way, I mean, they're going to become increasingly less attractive as business destinations. Their economies will suffer. Their companies will not benefit from the advantages and opportunities of the new green world that we're living in. So I think there's a lot of forces that are pushing governments and individuals and businesses into action. And I think it's also a mistake to see all the responsibility as lying at governmental level. We all have a part to play in this. And I think increasingly people recognize that their own lifestyles, their own way of living is important. So let me use my own children as an example. They're going to hate me for this. But they've both gone completely vegetarian. And one of the reasons for that is the impact of agriculture on the environment. And we know now that particularly animal husbandry is an extremely powerful and negative force in terms of climate change, in all sorts of ways, not least the fact that a lot of deforestation is driven by the need to farm animals and also grow animal feed. So I think that's one example of where, individuals are changing their lifestyles and doing things differently. And people like Greta Thunberg have been really instrumental in raising awareness of that and getting people to change the way that they live.
Thank you so much. I think, yes, we all have a role to play. We all have a part to play in all this. And I just want to pick up on that. You mentioned about, individual roles. But what are the sectors in business specifically that you see are already doing something positive? I think you mentioned some along the way in your address earlier. But are there any specific examples that you may want to highlight to all of us, either in Malaysia or in the UK or anywhere else, which we could sort of use as a good benchmark? Yeah.
I think the retail sector is taking a lead, certainly in the UK, and I think increasingly here in Malaysia too. So in terms of, for example, packaging, there's now a drive to reduce the amount of packaging, to reduce the amount of plastic waste that is being generated. I think that's important. But the big ticket item is the energy sector. So about 75% of global emissions are from energy, and that's where Malaysia has a real challenge. How do you transition from heavily coal-based energy transmission towards renewables? And one of the most exciting areas of change and technological development has been the renewable sector. So I was just reading the other day that the amount of solar that is now installed and operational, compared to the amount that was predicted to be installed back in 2005 when we had that G8 summit, is about 20 times greater than was anticipated. And in many parts of the world, the cheapest form of electricity now is installed solar. And that's a remarkable transformation.
Absolutely, yeah. I would like to open the floor for questions. If anyone has any questions for His Excellency, please come forward.
Madam Lavanya, this is Nuripa. I am online.
Sorry, where? I'm sorry. Yeah, is it online? Is it?
I'm online. I
Okay.
I couldn't type the question. Your Excellency, you mentioned about some challenges in Britain, and it was in the news that the social activists have gotten the British Parliament to do a inquiry commission on breaching of human rights and forced labor on the global supply chain, on the PPE that is being supplied to NHS, and the supplier from the PPE exporters from Malaysia. So what is your take on this, and how could you assist the Malaysian PPE suppliers to the NHS when really the inquiry is called by Parliament in UK?
Thank you for that question. Yes, so this is not directly related, of course, to climate change, but very much related to the wider ESG agenda, which is the issue of forced labour. And the UK, I'm proud to say, has been a bit of a groundbreaker in terms of legislating on forced labour, what we call modern slavery. So back in 2015, the UK Parliament passed a Modern Slavery Act, which demands that companies of a certain size take action to ensure that not only are they exploiting labour themselves, but also that their supply chains are similarly free of modern slavery. So we, of course, have been watching very carefully the debate in Malaysia over PPE production, glove production, and of course, as you all know, the US CBP has taken action against one or two Malaysian companies because of allegations of forced labour and labour practices. So the British National Health Service is a major buyer of surgical gloves, of course, from Malaysia. And I'm very pleased to say that they are taking increasingly strong action in the procurement for the NHS to ensure that the gloves that they procure are not from companies that are that have abusive labour practices, and they're introducing more methods, such as, for example, much more intrusive and snap audits to make sure that that is the case. I'm not aware, though, of a parliamentary inquiry into PPE and modern slavery. So that I don't know if that's a new development, but of course, it is something that's very politically significant. So it wouldn't surprise me if that was going to go ahead.
Thank you. That's in the papers, the Commission inquiry on NHS.
Thank you so much for the question. Anyone else here that would like to raise any questions for His Excellency? If not, I think one here, which might be related to the question that we just heard from Madam just now. But so the question goes, what is UK's view on the G in the ESG of Malaysia at the moment? How do UK investors look at this? Meaning, I suppose, the governance part of ESG, and what is the perspective of UK investors on soundness of governance aspect of ESG in Malaysia?
Well, UK companies have obligations under UK law. I've mentioned the Modern Slavery Act. There's also the Anti-Bribery Act. And all of these things are now long-standing and well embedded into British corporate governance. And whenever a British company will look to invest, wherever it might be, they will ensure that they're in compliance with those laws. But as I say, I think there's an increasing focus on carbon aspects, which of course is not an obligation in the same way, but it's increasingly going to become, if you like, a business obligation. As companies announce their own net zero ambitions, they can't afford to enlarge their carbon footprint through investments in places where there's a high intensity carbon. But I mean, on the positive side, we did quite a bit of work last year with the BMCC, the British Malaysia Chamber of Commerce, looking at supply chains. And one thing that companies often worry about is how difficult and how complex it is to decarbonize their supply chains. But the good news is that it's often not as difficult as you might think. And the costs of decarbonizing are actually very often a lot lower than you expect. So if you balance that off against the demands to reach a net zero, it starts to look like a good cost-benefit analysis. And one thing that I hope we'll see here in Malaysia and in every other investment destination is very strong efforts to make sure that investors are given a good welcome in terms of low carbon opportunities for themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Your Excellency. I mean, in the study I mentioned earlier that we did with BCG, we also found that there are a lot more opportunities in making this transition to net zero for jobs, for GDP growth, and it's really, we should see this as an investment. I guess I open the floor again, but I don't see anybody. Okay, let me continue because we have talked about, I guess all these opportunities and what actually businesses embracing these opportunities can benefit. We are also seeing, huge impacts already happening globally. We had impacts, of course, that was seen in Europe and in the UK as well. And then more recently here in Malaysia in terms of the terrible flooding events. And of course, businesses are going to be impacted by the impacts of climate change as well. Now, one of the tracks of discussions during COP26 was on loss and damage. And that was for the first time, I think also another first, if you'd like, that there was some discussion around it. But a lot of, civil society definitely, and probably more of the developing country were a bit disappointed that the outcome wasn't stronger and it's going to be advanced in Egypt. Your Excellency, do you have any insights on that in terms of how that could be advanced, to meet this very urgent need of this loss and damage that people are already, facing. Yeah.
Well, it's a very important issue, and yes, I think Malaysia's suffered recently through the flooding, which you can have a debate about how much that was caused by climate change and how much it would have happened anyway. But I think we can see now a pattern globally of more extreme weather events, whether it's fires, floods, landslides, you name it. And we're going to see more of these extreme weather events as we go forward. And that is going to be the case even if we do manage to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's absolutely without question. It's also clear that some countries are more vulnerable than others. And of course, we all think particularly of the small island states, some of whom literally might disappear underwater over the coming years as sea levels rise. And some countries are prone to extreme flooding, which is going to get worse and worse. So that was a major area of discussion at COP26, and one of the areas where we would like to see more progress over the coming year is in this process of adaptation. How do countries adapt themselves to this reality, which we can't avoid? I mean, these events are coming, whether we like it or not. And there is a financial undertaking from the developed world of $100 billion a year. And one of the disappointments, frankly, of previous years is that the developed world has not attained that $100 billion target. But we did see more financial undertakings from many major donors, like the US as well as the UK and others. And we believe that we'll reach that $100 billion target in about 2024. And that will be very significant in terms of funding for adaptation, which will benefit, I hope, a lot of the countries who are going to otherwise suffer extremely. But again, this is, from a business perspective, this is a major risk. If you're operating in a place which is prone to extreme weather events, we're going to see more shortages of water, shortages of resources. That's going to potentially provoke conflict, population movements. There is no upside to this change in weather that we're seeing globally.
And I think probably wearing your crisis hat, you see that more clearly than most of us do. And indeed, so when we undertake climate action with mitigation, adaptation is equally important. Otherwise, your investors are not going to come here, the supply chain is going to be disrupted. I have a few questions here on Zoom, which maybe I can pose to you, Your Excellency. One is, how do we encourage small and medium enterprises to participate in ESG? And maybe with a stronger climate focus as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, in the past, I guess, the pressure has been mainly on big business because of their shareholders, investors. A lot of SMEs, of course, are family owned. They're not subject to the same pressures. But, SME owners, employees and SMEs, they live in the world along with the rest of us. They're going to be just as aware as everybody else of all this that is going on. And I think what we're seeing in the UK is we're seeing that a lot of SMEs are also starting to get interested in climate issues. And even if you're a small manufacturer, a small producer, to be able to say that you're carbon neutral, that is becoming an increasingly positive thing. And increasingly, consumers are demanding that the places they buy their products, the people they're buying their products from, are carbon neutral, do have the environment in mind when they're producing. So I'm hopeful that this will happen largely through, increased awareness and increased demands from consumers.
Thank you. In fact, several years ago, we did a study on, green business, and we found a printing company here that was actually performing business in a sustainable manner, and they had managed to therefore export their services abroad because of that credential of being sustainable. Now, there's a question on, in your opinion, where do you think Malaysia's ESG practice stands at the moment? Are we on par with other developing countries in terms of, how we are advancing our corporate sector and ESG?
Gosh, that's a tricky one. very hard for me to make the comparison because I sit here in KL and very much focus on Malaysia. But the picture is probably similar, which is that, doing well in some areas, doing less well in others, but always there's more that can be done. I mean, that's true in every country. I mean, it's true in the UK. So I would just encourage policymakers, businesses here, to keep being ambitious and to keep pushing at the boundaries, because particularly when we're talking about climate, one of the things that we now know is that every little counts. And it's kind of easy to sort of give up and say it's all too big, it's all too difficult, but every single little thing that everybody does, every business does, counts, and it helps.
Absolutely. I think we are circling back to that point you made earlier very strongly, that everybody counts. Everybody's action counts, however big, however small. And again, any questions on the floor from here? Anyone wants to raise anything? If not, how are we doing on time? If I may ask the Secretariat. 5 more minutes? Okay. All right. Your Excellency, you very, clearly put that, maybe the 4 goals of COP26 was coal, car, trees, and cash, right? How do you see this playing out in Malaysia? I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, what are the areas that maybe the British investors, corporate investors, may want to see as advantageous in Malaysia? And perhaps that would be instructive for us here to understand also from the corporate perspective. What are those areas that you think might be interesting?
Yes, of course. Trees, the nature-based solution, Malaysia is a global player. I mean, in terms of overall emissions, Malaysia is relatively low on the scale. I forget the exact figures. You probably, I don't know if you remember them. Is it?
Yeah, it's under 1%, I think.
It's not, the biggest emitter, of course, biggest emitters, China, the US, and so on. So Malaysia is a relatively small emitter, but in the world of nature, Malaysia is a global player. And there, I think, there is potentially very significant interest in, for example, global carbon markets, and I know there's interest in developing that here. So that, I think, is a potentially very interesting one. And green finance overall, of course, is something that the UK is very prominent in. The City of London, of course, being one of the world's financial powerhouses. In terms of cars and, transport, energy, the UK has a very highly developed ecosystem of, if you like, consultancies and experts. So, for example, we've seen this with our work on smart cities, working with Malacca, working with Iskandar, to help them develop a new transport model which will be more people-focused but also more sustainable, reduce traffic, reduce emissions, and so on. We've got very clever designers who can design systems. We also see that with, for example, renewable energy. And the UK is not as strong as some others in, for example, making wind turbines. But what we're very good at is helping countries design wind farms and design power systems in order to maximize power yields, in order to minimize leakage. And that is a really important part of it, because we know that one of the big problems in all energy systems is leakage through the network. So that's one area where the UK, I think, can add real value, and where there's a lot of interest in working with Malaysia. And I think we're seeing some of those niche companies, for example, in our Smart Cities trade mission that's going to take place over the coming days.
Wonderful. And maybe just one last question. I know the UK government has got some partnerships with the Malaysian government to promote certain action, especially on climate. Could you tell us, maybe the audience here, what are some of the key areas that we are working together on with the Malaysian government now?
Yes, well, we have a very a very exciting program called PACT, which is Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transition. And we're partnering with the central government, but also regional authorities to look for quite specific ways that we can help decarbonize the economy, we can help drive carbon down. And, you know, we're doing some interesting projects in Sarawak, for example, and Sabah. And I mentioned our work with the KL city in terms of supporting them in their efforts to reach net zero. We're always looking for new ways that we can partner. You know, the UK is now becoming quite a major donor in terms of climate finance. I think our commitment now is some £11.5 billion. We need to find good partners to spend that money with. I'd like to be able to spend more and more of it here in Malaysia, in supporting Malaysia in their efforts to decarbonize their economy.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think that's a very good note to end on, and to end on the entire conference as well, because it really emphasizes the importance of partnerships. You know, partnerships and collective action. We have to think as global citizens as we take local action, and you know what happens in Malaysia is going to affect, you know, people in the UK. I mean, we are living really in very much borderless worlds when it comes to issues like climate change. So thank you so much, Your Excellency. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, and I think we've all been enlightened very much by your sharing with us today. Thank you so much, and thank you to KSI as well.
Thank you very much.